Hey everybody, Pete A. Turner, executive producer and host of the Break It Down Show. Today's episode welcomes back my friend Peter Van Buren. And Peter is an author, former State Department person, and I guess the thing that's most interesting about us is that we work together with the same units in the Army in Iraq. And he, of course, was in the State Department while I was in the Army. But either way, Peter and I have a great conversation about statecraft, kind of diving into this Iranian U.S. problem, trying to illustrate what is reality and what isn't. Frankly, we get into some of this Trump derangement syndrome where we take a look at a given situation and give up all the facts because, orange man bad. Not to undermine that position, because let's understand too that President Trump creates a lot of this insanity on purpose, and so he deserves the critiques that come from that. But this show is less about that, and it's more about understanding how a country like Iran and Iraq and Afghanistan and the U.S., how we all get along and try to deal with one another. By the way, in case you don't know and have a map in front of you, we're in Afghanistan, we're in Iraq, we're in Saudi Arabia, we're in Kuwait. We're in Turkey. We've surrounded Iran. And so, of course, they get a little bit testy because our presence, especially in the Persian Gulf, causes them a lot of problems and inability to operate and do the things they want to do as a sovereign nation. So these things aren't as simple as they usually seem in the news and when they downplay and just go straight to orange man bad. And that's sort of the point of this episode. We've got a bunch of other episodes on this topic. Check out our show with Fred Burton, which Jason Piccolo, myself, and Fred all look at this from the intel collector side of things and why we supported the killing of General Soleimani. And then literally the next day, we had Ambassador Robert Hunter and then Colonel John McKay and I talking about the statecraft level of it and why they felt it was a terrible move. So both things can be right at the same time. And so it gets really confusing. So we've covered this topic several times, kind of getting into what's what and trying to explain that. And I hope you guys all can appreciate that. Listen to all of these shows because they go together as a bigger body of work and help us understand statecraft and everything else. I think the most important point that you're going to get from this whole thing is just how small the State Department is and how big their task is. Hey, listen, I don't want to go on too much more. You guys will absolutely love this show. Peter is such a great guest that I'm ever thankful to him because he's just, I just think the world of him, and hopefully you guys will too. He writes often on the American Conservative in a way that, again, breaks down these current event problems in a way that makes sense. Hey, here's how you support the show. Share the show. Get the shirts. Go to the breakitdownshow.com. Subscribe. Can you please subscribe? That really helps me out. Then, of course, as always, we're going to ask you to support Save the Brave. Scott and I were just out yesterday with John Preston walking in support of his Project 22 and You, dealing with veteran suicide. So if you go to 22andU.org or you can donate at savethebrave.org, we're all trying to help keep veterans alive, especially with PTSD like myself, and we really appreciate it. Just a few dollars goes a long way. All right, thank you so much. Here comes Peter Van Buren.
Lions Rock Productions.
This is Jay
This
Moore.
is Greg Proops.
This is Jordan Harbinger.
This is Dexter from The Offspring.
This is Nathan
This is
East.
Sebastian Younger.
This is Rick
This
Marotta.
is Stuart Copeland.
This is Mick Gillette.
This is Andy Summers.
Hey, this is Skunk Baxter.
This is Gabby Reese.
This is Rob Bell.
Hey, this is John Leon Guerrero.
Hey, and this is Pete A. Turner.
Hi, this is Peter Van Buren, and you're listening to the Break It Down Show.
Yeah, I had Peter on, well, in part because I like Pete, and he's a friend of mine, and we've worked together in Iraq. And, with our news that recently happened between Iran and the U.S., and then there's always, the additional player of Iraq, I thought it important to bring someone, because, look, I can always give the ground perspective and the perspective of the guy that was looking at intel side of things, but Peter is a State Department pro. I mean, this is what he did for his career. And he does a great job of writing. He writes for the American Conservative a lot, but in general, you tend to break things down at a fantastic level, Peter. Like the repeated, if we remove Donald Trump and the craziness that happens when he's in the room, if we remove him from the equation and we look at this at a presidential level, it starts to become more clear. Like this isn't just a madman on either side going crazy. There's systems in place,
And this is extremely frustrating to me as someone who enjoys keeping up with the news, if you will, and trying to understand what's going on, is how much of facts, if you will, are basically distorted by Trump. He's like a giant black hole where educated people kind of lose their minds a little bit, and people who have spent their whole lives analyzing, studying, learning about a region suddenly throw that all out the window and start foaming at the mouth because it's President Trump instead of President fill in the blank. And this is something that people will study for years and years and years. But we saw it play out gratefully in a nonviolent way with North Korea. If you remember back a year or so ago, we kind of, no pun intended, rocketed from in 1 month talking about how Donald Trump, the deranged crazy man, is going to start World War III with North Korea, to Donald Trump, the deranged crazy man, is going to sell out the United States so that he can get an unfair peace treaty and claim his Nobel Peace Prize. And in between there, we kind of noodled around with Donald Trump, makes gay love to dictators around the world, and all sorts of kind of amateur pop psychology stuff. Mm-hmm. And I saw intelligent people, including colleagues from the State Department, because I spent 4 years in South Korea working at the embassy in Seoul. People that I knew to be intelligent, learned people on TV saying crazy things that made no sense. Fast forward to the situation in Iran, which is arguably much more complicated, and you've got the same thing going on. No one seems capable of sort of pushing their Trump derangement syndrome aside long enough to say, geopolitically, what's going on? What are the strengths and weaknesses of each player? And what are their goals? What do they hope to accomplish? I mean, this is sort of the basics of understanding geopolitics. Who has what do they want? How can they possibly achieve that? What are they willing to do to get it? You ask those questions and you usually come up with reasonable answers. But in the case of Donald Trump, we seem to have lost that skill, that ability. It's almost as if we're dumber now as a people, and particularly the media that we depend on to inform us.
Yeah, I mean, it's telling, like you said, there's so much expertise. This is what we covered in one of the earlier episodes is, the amount of hours and the college degrees and the experience in terms of careers that goes into putting General Soleimani's packet on the president's desk, which has happened more than once, which is an indicator that, he's a guy that does bad things, To get away from that and to consider him somehow some kind of hero, or even in Iran, to not even understand Iran well enough to know what a problem he is for a lot of Iranians, is just it's just detached from reality, Well,
let's try to see if we can sort some of it out.
Okay.
Maybe we could start in Iran. And I'm going to kind of chat a little bit here, but jump in and stop me when it sounds like I need to take a breath.
Okay, go ahead.
To begin with, first of all, I traveled to Iran last year, and I was lucky enough to meet with a cross-section of people. This was far from comprehensive or anything. I don't make those claims, but an awful lot of the people who are telling you what's going on in Iran have never been there and have never interacted with the Iranians on an official level. So I'll give myself a half point above, say, nearly everyone else at the New York Times.
Okay, fair enough.
Iran is a very complex country. We all know the story. It's one of the oldest countries in the world. It's had a unique culture, language, et cetera, for thousands of years. It's a developed country. This is not the third world. These are not people who are trying to figure out how to govern themselves or anything along those lines. They are governed by a very complex interaction among legitimately elected officials. There's no dictator in Iran. They have elections, but those elected officials exist in a very complex relationship with the clerics, the religious leaders and their subdivisions there, of course, and in the military and its various subdivisions, including the Revolutionary Guard. And, if you want to think of these entities in American terms, you've got the Revolutionary Guard, which Soleimani was the head of, are sort of the most aggressive inside of this governing structure. They're the ones who are the most certain that some form of kinetic action, whether it was terrorism or more traditional military or working with militias, is the answer to a lot of problems, or at least part of the answer. You've got clerics who have their own complex view of international relations that's highly influenced by their dislike of the Sunnis, particularly the Saudis and the Jews in Israel. And then you've got the elected officials who, in my personal interactions, are educated people with a very globalized view who are very interested in finding a way to bring Iran closer into the world system, and oftentimes are stymied by the other two groups. So this exists in a very delicate tension inside Iran, and it's by no means a simplistic situation where, hey, if you can get Kim Jong-un to go along with something, you pretty much are good to go. So you've got also Iran as a regional power in the Mideast, struggling against both other regional powers like the Saudis, like the Israelis, and at the same time fighting a massive ongoing war with the United States, a global power, and trying to figure out how to leverage its advantages. It's very clearly a little guy versus a very big guy. And, one of the ways traditionally, and by traditionally I mean going back to William Wallace and the Scots fighting the British in near prehistoric times, you leverage that is through the use of graduated violence. You might even call it terrorism, by organizing militias, by using proxy fighters. This is what you do when you don't have aircraft carrier groups. That's what Iran is all about. And that type of game, if you will, is a very difficult one to play well, because you have to push just hard enough against someone the size of the United States that you accomplish something geopolitically without inflaming them. In other words, you can't move to the point where the United States unleashes itself against you, because you will lose, possibly to the point of seeing your country destroyed, effectively destroyed. So you have to push, but you can't push too hard. You have to probe and look for soft spots and things like that. And Soleimani, for all of his, you can say what you want about him as a human being and which corner of hell he's going to be most comfortable in, but he had skills. He had this unique set of diplomatic, military, and organizational skills that kind of made him somewhere between Che, Lex Luthor, and Dwight Eisenhower. And he apparently, at the same time, was skillful enough to navigate within the Iranian power structures. He did what he did for quite a few years. He's a very important player in this. And the decision by the United States to kill him, assassinate him, blow him up, whatever, I don't care what word you use. Everyone's getting all worked up about this. But at the end of the day, it ends up pretty much the same, for him at least. He was a very important player. The U.S., as you mentioned in your intro, has considered killing him a number of times, and this was his turn. Whether there was indeed some imminent threat, however one defines that word, or whether we just knew that Soleimani, left to his devices, would be killing people, including Americans, sooner or later, it doesn't really matter. His role in all of this is well established, and whether he should have been killed 10 years ago, or whether we should have waited another 6 months and 3 days, those are questions others will argue over. But him dead is no loss to the world, and strategically a step forward for the United States, and a clear signal to the Iranians that somewhere along the way, whether it was a specific incident in Baghdad over New Year's, or whether it was an accumulation of actions, that Iran pushed too far and the big guy, the big dog, bit back.
Yeah.
Let me stop there for a second. That kind of brings us that kind of sets the scene on Iran. We stop there and drink a quart of tequila while you ask the next question. So,
Okay, fair enough. And then let me color
I
in a
drink
little
fast, but speak slowly.
bit. Let me color a little bit then, because we have other examples of this. You know, this basic exact premise happened, just a little bit more cataclysmic, but Muammar Gaddafi was running terror programs out of his country. He blew an airplane up full of people. And then President Reagan said, "Here's 2 missiles in your swimming pool, and I'm taking your son's life with me." And that completely changed how Libya responded towards us until we managed to get mad again and not handle it as well. So we have a situation where we do see this escalation. And look, when does Iran check itself? Whenever it gets itself what it wants, and it's just going to continue to go to the store and steal Twinkies out of the rack until, and bigger things. Now it's a 12-pack of beer. Now it's a case of beer. Now it's all of the hot burritos and I'm using a 7-Eleven analogy, but they weren't going to stop. They weren't going to do smaller things. It was going to always be bigger. And then, Peter, I want to bring in this part too, because this is important. If we look any way further back into the history of Iran, it was full of Jews. There were tons of Jews there. There were Zoroastrians and all kinds of other, it was a very, I don't want to say Western because they're in the Orient, but it was a very progressive place where things happened. And then, the revolution comes down and all of that goes away. And this whole nonsense.
Let me stop you though, Peter, because inside Iran, they are very careful, including clerics that I spoke with, very careful to differentiate between what they believe, what they call Jews and what they call Zionists.
Okay.
And for example, the group that I went to Iran with included a rabbi from New York City here.
Okay.
Who went and he insisted on wearing his religious garb in meetings with clerics and things like that. And everyone was very, very careful to differentiate between people who are Jews, either culturally, historically, or religiously, and what they call Zionists, which are the political leaders of Israel who pursue geopolitical goals for Israel. It's a fine line and it's an arguable line, but to them, it matters, and anything that matters to the other side is exploitable by our side.
Yeah.
And so we don't want to just too quickly kind of throw the Iranians into a big box labeled anti-Semite, when in fact they've given us a crack to see what we can poke into. So sorry to interrupt you.
No, well, yeah, and that's fair, because I was going to actually, the next place I was going is there are a lot of people in Iran that feel this way, that are still very progressive in their view. And the government of Iran is, although democratically elected, and sometimes questionably so, it is always on the precipice, because there is this significant struggle between the past and the future. And then meanwhile, there's a little bit to the west where you and I were, and I ran all around Baghdad province and other provinces as well. But even Shia people in Iraq do not want, and I'll say even stronger, hate Iranian influence in their government. I mean, was it Prime Minister Alawi that was almost prime minister but couldn't seat a government, and so it went back to Maliki, who was a Shia-friendly person. All of the Shias, all of them that I talked to, said we want Alawi. We don't want Maliki because he brings Iran with him, and we want our own country, over and over again. So when you say this stuff is complex, I'm trying to illustrate for everybody, it's complex. And trying to understand.
It is very complex.
Yeah.
And so you've got Iran, who is, and again, I'm not a terrorist apologist, or you got to put those emotional words aside and say, geopolitically, if I'm a little green man from Mars studying the Earthlings,
yes, what
do I see? And with Iran, they're trying to leverage the authority and power that they have in what they believe is a struggle for their own survival. And the Iranians are absolutely convinced, and I got this from individuals, from academics, certainly from people in official positions, absolutely convinced that the United States government with the Israeli government wants to destroy them as a nation. Mm-hmm. And that may or may not be true or whatever, but they believe it the same way that you and I believe breakfast comes before lunch.
Right.
And Soleimani was was an extension of that belief. And he was good at what he did. The United States took him out. And any idiot who thought this was going to lead to World War III truly has never read a book, because we were engaged in what in the State Department, I don't know if the military had a different term for it, we called it escalation dominance.
Right.
And the idea would be that somebody steps it up, and sending a Hellfire missile into Soleimani was clearly a step up in terms of escalation. The other side has two choices, right? I mean, they can go another level and expect to be answered as such, or they can signal they're going back. They're taking a step down. And that's clearly what was going to happen, because the Iranians are at such a huge disadvantage technologically, militarily, compared to the resources of the United States, that there's no way in the world they could risk going up. In other words, taking over the embassy in Baghdad, blowing up an American entity, killing school children, whatever you want to say they were going to do.
Right.
It was obvious they couldn't possibly do that, because it would have broken the rules of escalation dominance that have been in place for a very, very long time. And the Iranians understand how this all works. Something that's been not talked about, that was very much on my mind watching all this, is the last time that the Iranians, well, maybe not the last time, but certainly one of the most significant times in U.S.-Iranian relations since 1979, when the Iranians said, we really want to find a way back into the system, was in 2003. If you go back and look at what was going on, the United States still didn't realize that it screwed up in Afghanistan. The world saw the attack on Afghanistan as largely a success. Afghanistan, of course, is Iran's western border. And the world saw the U.S. invasion of Iraq as a success. The Iranian government in 2003 suddenly woke up to find the most powerful military in human history on both of its borders, mm-hmm. with a relatively weak Soviet Union and a lot of scared people across the Middle East, not sure what America was going to do. And the Iranians put out feelers all over the place to the United States. Let's talk, let's figure something out. I know, and I don't want to discuss it in too much detail, but there were individuals I knew personally in the State Department who were engaged in direct negotiations on foreign soil with the Iranians about creating some sort of relationship in that context.
Right.
It all fell apart. A combination of George Bush saying no, never mind the speech. By the time he made his Axis of Evil speech, this was already in the trash can. George, the White House wanted nothing to do with making deals with Iran. And very quickly, the Iranian side lost interest, because they very quickly saw that the United States had stepped in the mud in Afghanistan, and they saw the American invasion of Iraq falling apart, and they realized they actually weren't in any particular danger. But at the moment they thought they were in danger, their instinct was to come up with some sort of a deal with the United States. That's an important lesson. And it was one that made it clear to me we weren't going to World War III with the death of Soleimani, but our, again, deranged media couldn't get enough fear out there on the airways.
Peter, they were getting people drafted. They crashed the civil service. I mean,
that absolutely killed me.
What? Okay, look.
That absolutely slayed me.
Yeah.
That and for your listeners who don't know, I mean, what you're talking about, of course, is enough millennial kiddies out there decided World War III was coming, that they crashed the Selective Service website with inquiries, and they flooded social media, absolutely convinced they were going to be, a draft was going to be reinstated, and they were all going to be, in the army by the end of the week. And, it's like, oh my goodness, people.
And yeah, look, and these people are the future,
Yeah, that's a whole nother nightmare interview about what is, parenthetically, it's part of all this, because you ask yourself, are folks going to be able to snap back?
Yeah.
In less than a year, Donald Trump is either going to be reelected and we're going to have to do 4 more years of this, or, okay, he doesn't get reelected and we're going to have to become normal again and start processing the actions of a new president. But either way, we can't really continue as we're doing this incredible lurching from crisis to crisis, because it's muddied our thinking. It's made it impossible for us to understand things. And some of this stuff gets complicated. Americans are not good at that in general, but in geopolitical terms, we're really bad at understanding complexities. That sort of, in a sentence, describe the year you and I spent in Iraq together. So you got all that. But basically, bottom line is Iran was never going to escalate this thing. We also found out, the Wall Street Journal has done some reporting, that even as the rockets were flying missiles were flying out of Iran, the Iranians were directly communicating with the United States through Swiss intermediaries.
Right.
There's long been a back channel. The Swiss have an embassy in Tehran, and they represent American interests there, as they do in other places in the world, including in Pyongyang. And there's always been a back channel, but from what the Wall Street Journal was reporting, this was an active communication, live, real-time communication that was going on between the United States and Iran to make sure that everyone's intentions were being understood, and that the Iranians in particular were communicating that they were launching a missile strike. It was a singular event. It was going to happen, and then it was over. And that's the tit for tat. And
right.
it was 2 sides saying to each other, we're done if you're done. Well, I'm done. Are you done? I'm done. Are you done? And again, that plays into this Trump derangement syndrome problem, where he's painted in our media as out of control, impulsive, that we don't have a functioning State Department, right. That, his finger is twittering above the nuclear button, blah, 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 blah. And the answer, of course, was no, that wasn't the case at all. A lot of very sane, calm people were talking to each other, literally in the midst of the missiles in flight, to make sure things stayed inside the white lines. Again,
that
a lesson
does not
that
agree
was
with
not
my narrative, Peter. I just don't.
Right, and that's the whole problem, is that most of the reporting that we receive, as well as the actions now of most of our politicians, the Republican and Democrat, are all agenda-driven. The answer is already set before we even ask the question. And I don't know about you, but as this was all going on with Soleimani and everything, I struggled just to find the basics of what was going on. Never mind what it all meant or anything like that, but literally who said what, who did what. I don't care about Twitter and what hashtag is trending.
Right.
What actual things have happened, and who said who said something that mattered, that was said by someone who mattered. I really didn't care about the clever rejoinders that were coming out of Kitty Cat 777, who was just, killing it with memes.
Yes.
No, I don't know. I don't care about that.
Well, that's because there's adult business going on, and you're great at doing this. Like, if we count all of the things that President Trump, look, and I'm no fan of President Trump. I can say these words over and over again, and I constantly am accused of being called a Trump supporter. I'm not. I'm not going to vote for him. Didn't vote for him. I appreciate that he has the ability to get some things right, but I wish he would do things slightly differently, you know. But the reality is that he was a Nazi. I'm going to miss 100 of these things. World War III several times in North Korea. The Syrian debacle when he did the exact same thing, back-channeled, said rockets are coming. Assad's going to pay the price. This is going to be innocuous. Get out of the way. Here it, as calm and as sane as that kind of reaction can be, you know. And then again, when he moved the embassy in Jerusalem. And I know you know all these things, but I'm just off the top of my head creating. He's not going to leave office after his second term. All of these things that just they're not even based in reality. Then all they are is meant to spread fear.
I made a partial list that this goes all the way back to before Trump was even sworn in. People might remember that the Taiwan leadership made a congratulatory phone call to him. And the idea that he took a phone call from the president of Taiwan was supposed to start a war with China. Paul Krugman of the New York Times famously wrote an article right after the election predicting depression in the United States caused by Trump. After that, in no particular order, there was supposed to be a global economic war with China over trade sanctions. World War III was going to start withdrawing from NATO. World War III was going to start when he bombed the Russian bases in Syria, the moving of the embassy in Jerusalem, pulling out of Obama's nuclear agreement. Of course, North Korea, the endless ongoing thing that he's erratic, mentally impulsive, has a small peepee, that he's going to do X, Y, or Z, distract from Mueller, Comey, the impeachment. We're going to go to war with Russia over Venezuela. There's going to be a genocide of Kurds because of Turkey. We're going to have a war in the Middle East because Iran attacked the Saudi oil facility or shot down a drone. We're going to have a civil war in the United States after Charlottesville. Trump is going to try to find a way to cancel the midterms or the next election, or if he loses, he won't lose the White House. And this doesn't even get into the near wall-to-wall coverage that was devoted to the fact that Trump was an actual Russian spy asset sitting in the Oval Office with no purpose other than to do that. Right. Or the contradictory things that he's getting rich off of the emoluments on his hotels, while at the same time he's actually deeply in debt. If we could only see his hidden taxes, these things, the fact that these things contradict each other, the fact that typos in his tweets become breaking news items, the list is quite literally 3 years long. None of it has been true. And all of it becomes the filter through which we look at something like the killing of Soleimani, and you end up with people, Democratic elected people, literally grieving the death of someone who is personally responsible for killing American citizens and interfering with American strategic aims. Whatever you think about him, he's the enemy. That's it. There's no gray area on Soleimani. And yet we created one simply because Trump killed him. I mean, honest to God, it's like Trump, Trump's famous statement, hey, I could shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue and I wouldn't lose any support. You literally have turned that around. Trump could save a blind orphan's life on Fifth Avenue, and Rachel Maddow would claim that was an existential threat to democracy somehow. I mean, you literally have gotten to the point where we're ready to declare oxygen bad because Trump breathes it.
Hey, this is P.A. Turner from Lions Rock Productions. We create podcasts around here. And if you, your brand, or your company want to figure out how to do a podcast, just talk to me. I'll give you the advice on the right gear, the best plan, and show you how to take a podcast that makes sense for you, that's sustainable, that's scalable, and fun. Hit me up at pete@breakitdownshow.com. Let me help. I want to hear about it.
We're ready to declare oxygen bad because Trump breathes it.
Yeah, and you see him responding with that. I mean, when he was elected, he said there's fake news everywhere, and I'll be damned. It's constantly granted to him. They've taken someone who they hate and they claim is crazy, who acts crazy and does things that are loathsome, and they're making him the normal one. It's just so.
It was. David Brooks, who I have nothing good to say about generally. David Brooks is a columnist for the New York Times. But this week, he actually, in a very rare breath of self-examination, he wrote, Donald Trump is impulse-driven, ignorant, narcissistic, and intellectually dishonest. So you'd think that those of us in the anti-Trump camp would go out of our way to show we're not like him, that we're judicious, informed, mature, and reasonable. But in fact, the anti-Trump echo chamber is becoming a mirror image of Trump himself, overwrought, uncalibrated, and incapable of having an intelligent conversation. It pains me to say that David Brooks summed up what I've been thinking about the media and Democrats and academics, but yet, in fact, that's what he did.
He did, and I think I agree with basically everything he said. I might pick some different adjectives, but those ones will serve the purpose for this conversation for sure.
Those will work, yeah. Exactly. And and we joke about, well, okay, I joke about people on social media and everything else like that. I mean, they're meaningless. They don't matter. But this has clearly moved into the halls of politics.
Right.
The actions of the Democrats that are in power in the House and the statements of the Democratic candidates running for president now all reflect all this. There's the gap. There's no daylight between the weird, crazy, deranged, uneducated things that Democratic leaders are saying and what Kitty Cat 777 is saying on Twitter. The daylight there has disappeared, and we're Soleimani might have been a pretty good guy, and Trump had no legal authority. Good gracious, American presidents have invaded how many countries since 2001, and we're worried about legal authority on a single missile strike? Obama killed several American citizens with missiles, and we didn't really seem to bat an eye about that. In fact, the guy who approved those killings legally, Eric Holder, who was then Attorney General, is spoken in many circles as a potential vice presidential candidate for the inevitable white person the Democrats are going to put forward as their candidate. Holder, of course, is African American. So, I mean, we don't seem to really be too worried about these legalities, except when they can be used to vilify Trump, even if that is hypocritical and makes no sense. And at that point, why am I paying attention to someone who's hypocritical and makes no sense? Well,
I don't know. I don't have an answer for that.
It's a rhetorical question, Pete. I didn't expect an answer.
No, I get that it's a rhetorical question, but I mean, it is the appropriate question. Like, what are we supposed to do? Because this does have this effect, right? So now instead of leading, let's call them the 125 million people, or that would follow a good, solid Democratic candidate, instead of being a leader, we're just trying to find the person that can simply beat President Trump, and that's just no way to lead a party. And I've wondered, when was the last time, if ever, have we, like you and I, sit there and go, Peter, this country is full of so many incredible people that are wonderfully talented, and I just look at these two candidates for president. Gosh, I'm so torn on which one I want more. They're so wonderful. Either one could do the job. Like, we don't create that. What we create is this ever decreasing. It's like someone said it. Well, I didn't say it, but it's like Survivor, where you're striving for mediocrity. We're trying to find the most popular mediocre person we can find to do this job, and it just drives me crazy.
That's it, and we don't even have the as many rules as Survivor does. I mean, we're kind of just throwing everybody into the water. It's a very troublesome situation for someone like myself and you that have made a life out of watching these things and at least pretending that we're a little more objective than the next person. Like I said, that we're the space alien from Venus looking down on these curious Earthlings. I mean, when you try to assume that intellectual stance, the stuff looks crazier and crazier, because you throw out the ends justify the means side of arguing, where, well, at least if it gets Biden elected, I'm glad we said those crazy things. Once you take the Venusian position, then that all goes out the door too, and you can't justify the ends with the means. You're just looking at crazy people running in circles, the anthill that gets kicked over. One thing that we didn't touch on, and the media seemed to start down this road for a while, and then for some reason they just walked away from it in the recent episode with Iran, was the idea of Iran becoming a nuclear power. And we heard Trump in his, when he took his victory lap on Iran, that little speechlet he made, say some pretty disingenuous things about the Obama nuclear accord that he pulled us out of. And some of that was a little bit unfair and not particularly accurate either.
Yeah.
But the idea of Iran as a nuclear power is something that is very much in everyone's calculus. And I saw initially when Soleimani got killed, some people talking, well, this is going to spur Iran to become a nuclear power. And if only Trump had not pulled out of the Obama agreement, we wouldn't be worrying about this. And that seems to have gone away for the time being, but I think it's worth talking about because it's really very straightforward. There are a range of countries around the world, including Iran, including Saudi Arabia, South Korea, Japan, probably, who knows, the Czech Republic, that are what we would call threshold countries. They are countries that are in various states of nuclear competency and thus in various places on the road from nothing to functioning nuclear weapons. So if you take, I don't know, Ghana, and say Ghana has no threshold capability, right? They've got the only nuclear thing in the country is somebody's microwave. So there's Ghana at one end, and then at the far end might be a country like, say, Saudi Arabia, who could probably put together a functioning nuclear weapon within, say, a year.
Mm-hmm.
That period of time is known as the breakout period. And so if the breakout period for Ghana is 30 years, the breakout period for Saudi Arabia, let's just say, is a year. Okay, this is very important. What's up with Iran? Iran is a threshold country. They have all of the pieces to make a nuclear weapon as well as the missiles to deliver it. What the Obama nuclear agreement did was potentially stretch that breakout period. Prior to Obama, Iran many people felt was somewhere in the months range if they decided to push from where they stood to where they had a functioning weapon. The nuclear agreement, if everything had worked the way it was supposed to, would have put them at least at a year breakout period, maybe even a little bit longer, meaning that if this morning they said, to hell with it, let's go all the way to a functioning weapon as fast as we can, it was going to take them a full year, and the world had a year to sort of figure out what to do about that. But the Obama agreement was never intended to, nor did anyone ever claim on either side that it was going to denuclearize Iran. Parentheses, any agreement we ever get with North Korea will be something like this. It will move them from a nuclear state, which they are now, to a breakout period. They're never going to throw it all in the dumpster and say we're done. So that's what the Obama agreement did. And by withdrawing from the agreement, the United States said, we don't care what you do. And the Iranians have so far more or less stuck with the terms of the Obama agreement. I'm not going to argue picolitres and some of the super technical things where people are arguing they've stepped over lines or not. Some of that we don't know. Some of it is highly technical. But the bottom line is they have roughly stayed in that 1 year-ish breakout zone. And they sort of always have to. They can nudge it forward a little bit if they want. But the Iranians know damn well that the United States and certainly Israel will not allow another nuclear power to exist in the Middle East. There's only two, and that's Israel and that's us.
Yeah.
And it's been that way forever, and it will always be that way, because a nuclear Iran or a nuclear Saudi or a nuclear anybody would simply upset the balance of power far, far, far too much, too quickly, in the wrong way. And the Iranians know they can't become a nuclear power. We know they can't become. The Israelis know. And that's that. The people who have tried Libya, Iraq, Syria, have gotten their wee-wees whacked. In all three of those cases, the U.S. and/or Israel took direct action to stop them from becoming nuclear powers. You and I spent some time in Iraq at a delightful little pussy place called Cache South, right?
Yeah.
Which was the site of the Iranian nuclear reactor that the Israelis bombed when they felt the Iraqis had gone a step or two too far. That was what that big berm was all about.
Let me add in some color here, because this is something that
please.
Basically nobody would know about Tuwaitha, Cache South, same place. When I went around and talked to the Iraqis, you'll never guess who they said did that. And I'll tell you right now, it wasn't the Israelis. It was the Iranians.
Well, that's who they were really fighting at that time, right? I mean,
and even though we know differently, at least we believe differently, they absolutely refute. I'm like, no, the Israelis did that. They're like, absolutely not. The Iranians did this.
Yeah.
And so you have this situation where this is how these things get out of hand quickly, right? Like you have these nuclear capabilities that are attacked, and now we can't even get Iraq to agree on who attacked it. It's just...
Yeah, every country gets its history pretty wrong, but
yeah,
that again, when the Israelis absolutely did do that when they bombed that reactor. Iran and Iraq were actually at war with one another and were lobbing missiles at each other's cities, and it would have made sense to someone who wasn't paying attention that was the most likely culprit. But yeah, it was surprising that 20 years later, they still didn't know the real story.
Yeah.
But neither here nor there. The point is that when you get too close to where we think you're getting too good at this or you're getting too close, somebody steps in. And I think you can go back and look in with Iran. The Stuxnet virus was, I think, I don't know enough about the details. We don't know enough about the details, but it was either a brushback pitch to say to the Iranians, no, you're getting too close.
Right.
Or it was a kind of proof of concept, a way to show the Iranians that we had tools and abilities to mess with their nuclear program way cooler than just dropping bombs from the sky. That, if you're going to play with the big kids, this is the way things can get done.
Yeah.
So...
The
idea is that...
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. No, I mean, the summation is that Soleimani's killing has nothing to do with Iran's nuclear program or where it's headed, period, closed.
So when you look at this overall, and obviously it's completely unfair to assess this thing, it's been a fucking week, but... When you look at this as a State Department guy, and you're tasked with go figure out what we're going to do with Iran, are you happy that this has happened, or are you like, God damn it, where are you at?
Those are emotions, and I don't have those in my as a professional. What I do say is, does this give me anything to work with? And the answer, I think, is yes. Soleimani was a powerful person inside the Iranian government structure. I don't know if he was the number 2 man in Iran, like the media says, but he was an important guy.
Yeah.
And what he represented was even more important. The aggressive side, the use of military power side of Iranian foreign policy. He was important as a symbol as much as an individual, though he was important as an individual. He's gone. Forget what you think about the circumstances of his death, but he's gone now, and that weakens that leg of the people who are running Iran. And if I were the State Department, I would have somebody on a plane to Geneva or wherever we clandestinely meet with the Iranians. I would have somebody on the plane saying, yeah, terrible tragedy, we mourn his loss, blah, 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 but isn't this a chance now?
Yeah.
You guys in the Iranian government who were not in favor of all this military action, aren't you just a little higher on the pole right now? Can you talk to us?
Yeah.
And that's what I would be doing. I see it as an opportunity for diplomacy. I see the perception that Trump isn't taking any crap as an opportunity for diplomacy. Go back, in time a little bit to Black Hawk Down,
Right.
where a bunch of Somali, they're not even organized in street gangs, tragically killed a couple of Americans and got the United States to turn tail and run out of Somalia. Go back a little further, the tragic loss of well over 200 Marines in the Beirut bombing in 1983. The United States packed up and ran out of Lebanon. We're a different America now, for better or worse. We are scarred and coarser. We're not going to be chased away if some Iranian-backed militia, God help us, kills a few people in Iraq. We're a different country post 9/11.
Right.
And again, if I was a diplomat in charge of these things, I would see that as an opportunity. I would go to the Iranians and say, you're going to get nothing out of more violence. We're past all that. We absorb it. We'll take the punch and we'll throw a harder one back. That's the new version of America. So instead, here's our window. Here's our opportunity. You go to your hardliners and say Soleimani is dead. I go to my hardliners and say Soleimani is dead. Let's do something.
Let's do something else. Right.
Yeah.
Does Iran? Does Sistani? Does he want a deal? Does he want to come back? I mean, we've built off ramps all the time for guys like but what do you think?
Iran is a complicated place because we talked earlier about the way that they're very, very careful to separate out their view of the Jews from the Zionists.
Right.
And I got an awful lot of that same thing about the difference between how the Iranians view the Americans versus the American government.
Right.
And, half the people in Iran have relatives in the United States. Every young person I talked to was familiar with the popular movies and TV and music in America.
Right.
There is a huge cultural flow going back and forth. There's a lot of people flows. The U.S. sanctions are very painful. They've choked off consumer goods. They've made it harder to get anything other than sort of basic foodstuffs for many people. There's a desire to rejoin the world system there, and an understanding that they'll have to kind of pay some dues in order to do that. But at the same time, there's this sense, and it certainly is in the government, of, we'll figure out a way to pay some dues, but we are not going to become an American client, a Western client state to do that. We are going to remain who we are and who we think we are, and we're going to be pursuing our own foreign policy and geopolitics, which is going to clash with yours. But if you're willing to accept that, then we're willing to look for some gray areas to cooperate in. The problem is that successive American presidents since 1979, and that's 5 different regimes, American regimes, however many there are, Republican and Democrat, have not been willing to sit down with the Iranians and see if there's a way that we can be frenemies in the Middle East. We've demanded things from them that they're not going to give. For example, giving up the nuclear program, pulling back out of Lebanon completely and Iraq completely. I mean, they're just not going to do that. It's far against their own interests. And as long as Republican presidents, followed by Democrats, followed by Republicans, keep those conditions where they are, we're only going to be able to negotiate these kind of little interim, treaty-lets like the Obama people were able to pull off. It was good. I'm glad. I support it. But it really, didn't change everything. It kind of just cleaned it up a little edges, ragged edges. So it's going to take a change in mindset in the United States that I haven't seen any signs of in literally 50-some years.
Right.
Across multiple things. So it's hard to be optimistic, but I'm certainly not pessimistic. I think status quo is the name of this game for the near and medium term at least.
I was talking with Robert Hunter, ambassador during the Clinton era, was the ambassador to NATO, and I was asking him, like, about statecraft and the challenges of being a good foreign policy president, because you can be great at it. It doesn't mean you're going to get a good result because timing, and there's 190 other countries that have a say. But who would you say was the last really talented statesman who sat in the White House?
Wow. I'm kind of stumped right there because I think, unfortunately, from Eisenhower forward, America's foreign policy has been so nearly totally controlled by domestic political needs that even folks who had the chops were hamstrung by the domestic political needs, and so they didn't do the right things, or they didn't handle them very, very skillfully.
Yeah.
I really am kind of being uncommittal on the answer because I don't think any of the post-war presidents past Eisenhower ever really tested themselves as full-on foreign policy folks.
Right.
I think they used foreign policy largely for either ideological little thrusts like Ronald Reagan did with the silly Contras in Nicaragua. I mean, what came of that?
Right.
Or, it was a lot of theater. We'll stick with Reagan. He's dead, so people can't, send in those cards and letters. But
right.
Or you went for the big theatrical events where we'd have the summit meetings with the Russian leader and make a big pomp and circumstance out of it all. But the U.S. is kind of a foreign policy skillful player. I'm kind of scratching my head. I mean, if you want to throw a little love at the first George Bush and the way that he put together his coalition against Saddam in 1991, maybe a point or two there. I was disappointed in Obama not doing more. I think particularly right after he was elected, he was the king of the world.
Yeah.
And I think he could have stuck his nose into any number of foreign policy problems, like the Middle East or something, and really made a hard push to get something changed. He had his pivot to Russia, his pivot to Asia. None of that amounted to anything, and were largely just show for domestic things. I think that's a big part of the problem, is that the way we elect presidents, and the fact that the next campaign starts the afternoon of the inauguration,
right,
limits the foreign policy skills and ends up doing what we usually end up doing, which is, playing at the edges of things, doing a lot of goofy stuff with the CIA that usually backfires or makes us look bad. So I think we're waiting for a great foreign policy president of the modern era.
We were talking again about it, and he said, George H.W. was the last guy that really had the skills. He said that President Clinton was risk-adverse, and that cost him problems. Obviously, President Bush's big gamble didn't pay off. President Bush the younger. It's been a lot of failure. And then if we are going to put you state folks to work, wouldn't it be great if there were 10 Peter Van Burens instead of just one? Everywhere I went, there was just never enough State Department people to create governance and rule of law and all these things. It was done piecemeal with some contractors who were all trying to get paid but not get killed. Not that anyone's trying to get killed, but I don't know how many people I saw who focused on governance who never left the camp. And you're like, how are you going to go create governance in the country? All the enemy has to do is stand there and undermine you. And I consistently was able to measure the distance between the people and the government and realize that there is no connection there. And it takes a lot of people with your kind of skills to go out and close that distance so people can have a government. But that means you have to buy a couple less B-2 bombers that cost $2.2 billion apiece.
Well, State Department people are relatively cheap if you really want them. One of the many things that has me just banging my head against the wall, and all the talk about how Trump has destroyed the State Department. But people don't seem to realize that the number of foreign service officers, serious diplomats, has been relatively unchanged since the aftermath of World War II.
Yeah.
It currently is around 5,000, depending on how you count these things. In comparison, that's roughly the complement on one aircraft carrier. You could take the entire
Right.
foreign service, and you'd have room left over on the aircraft carrier for a couple of other people. Now, there's civil servants and there's technical people and all that other good stuff, and so the numbers can get a little goofy. But the bottom line is the core diplomatic force of the United States has been relatively unchanged over the last 70-some years, the number of people. At the same time, the United States, the State Department has insisted on a physical presence, an embassy in nearly every country that we have relations with. They've finally combined a few in Africa and the Caribbean. But we insist on taking that small number, 5,000 diplomats, and spreading them thin, which makes it's not a force multiplier, it's a force diluter.
Right.
Couple that with the lack of great secretaries of state, men or women who could actually stand next to the generals in the Oval Office and make a case to the president. How far back do you have to go with that? I don't know. George Shultz was a good one, but I mean, James Baker was a good one in that regard, where they really were an equal player with the military as far as the president's attention was concerned. But in recent memory, you've got two folks who, I mean, I don't know if Mike Pompeo actually qualifies as Secretary of State. I mean, he seems to be kind of an omnibus figure in the Trump administration. He's currently, he has a title, which is Secretary of State, but I don't know that he's running the State Department. I think that's just keeping him in the family. Tillerson before him, John Kerry and Hillary Clinton both used their time as Secretary of State basically to try to create B-roll for their presidential campaigns, which didn't even really work out. Sorry about that. During the Bush administration, nobody paid any attention to the State Department. It was all about the Pentagon. So, I mean, you have a very weak diplomatic establishment, and the State Department itself has found ways to make itself weaker and to lessen its own impact inside the foreign policy establishment inside Washington, D.C. And nothing has been done during the Trump administration to change that. And 4 more years of Trump will just reinforce the uselessness of the State Department. I doubt that a Democratic president, with all the issues that he or she is going to be facing, even if their intention is good, I doubt they're going to devote any time to rebuilding the State Department. They're going to have, if you take a look at the Democratic candidates, they're all running on domestic issues. You don't even hear them talk much about foreign affairs. And I really doubt on day one, President Sanders or President Warren is going to say, never mind healthcare, let's get that State Department cranked up. Isn't going to happen. So again, with best intentions, I just don't see it. So without a diplomatic force out there in the world, then what do? Well, we do what we've been doing, which is bounce along with this odd combination of military and intelligence people and contractors and wannabes and has-beens and what have you, and then we keep getting surprised when the results kind of don't play out well.
Yeah, we're sort of like this roid-raged frat boy who's drunk as hell. That's sort of how we handle it. Like, we might punch you in the mouth, we might hug you and tell you how much we love you. You just don't know what you're going to get from us. And I'm always struck.
You just don't know.
You just don't know. And I'm always struck by, like, and I'm sort of a dove in hawk's clothing, or, either way around maybe. But when I look at these things, I always think, if you have the most powerful military in the world, how are you not going to use it? What person of power is going to be like, leave him in Kansas, But if you had the most powerful diplomatic force in the world and you were able to deploy that, and you said core, heck, core is 25,000 people, like in terms of military reference, you're talking about a brigade of 5,000. What if there were 25,000 people to go out and work these problems to get off the main route in Afghanistan? You might actually have had look,
Probably not. But you might have actually had a chance in Afghanistan. But there was never a chance because the Taliban controlled 99% of the ground.
That's right. It's I had a diplomat from an allied country, an English-speaking allied country, once characterized quite I would say warmly, but accurately. He said, you're like a very large autistic child, and
right.
there's this 6'6" muscled human with a brain that's functioning at a very different level and very different place, and the problem for the rest of the world is we never know what to do. Do we treat you like a 6'6" muscled human being, or do we treat you like a 4-year-old?
Right. Yeah.
And that's what we never know what to do with you.
Can we throw in bipolar too? Because every 4 years we're just going to totally change.
We might as well add bipolar. And I think it's one of the interesting things that I learned as a diplomat is that other countries have massive diplomatic resources devoted solely to trying to manage the United States.
Yes, it's embarrassing.
Particularly countries that well, but it's true.
It is true.
The number of people in the Canadian Diplomatic Corps, for example, who are devoted to dealing with the United States. In the time I was in Korea, the Korean Foreign Ministry basically had 3 offices. They had one that dealt with North Korea, the biggest one which dealt with the United States, and then the other office which kind of did everything else. And clearly, they needed to manage us, and they worked very hard at it. Many of them were quite good at it, especially because unlike the United States, they didn't bounce their diplomats around randomly the way we do, where, you're in the U.S. State Department and, oh, well, you did a tour in Europe, so we can't have you do another one in Europe, so we're going to send you to South America.
Yeah.
The classic German that you speak, well, anyway, good luck. I think they speak Portuguese down there.
Yeah.
They had people whose whole careers were devoted to the United States and studying the United States and managing the United States, which, in practical terms meant managing me.
Right.
As, I was sort of there when it's like you kind of learned, okay, he's my guy over in the Korean Foreign Ministry, and apparently I didn't realize this, but I'm his guy over here in the American Embassy, because I took over from the last guy.
Right.
And you come to realize that we are such a big player but yet we're so clumsy about it. It often is extremely frustrating that when it comes time to, when the president's going to visit Tokyo, we can turn out a literal army worth of security people.
Yeah.
But when the Japanese call us up and say, we have this crisis, and we say, but it's Saturday.
Yeah.
We don't have anybody available because, we're not a big enough group to have 24/7 operations. The American government is closed today. I'm terribly sorry.
Sorry. Tim's got the flu. Come back in a couple of days. You got the guy, he's like laying there like, I can't move. The entire embassy is shut down.
Well, even going back to our little soiree there in Iraq, when the new military units arrived, and the colonel, who was theoretically my peer, he had this massive operation with staff and people, and it's like, it's just me, sir.
Right.
I don't have, if you want me to have PowerPoint slides at the briefing, I have to sit down and make them.
Yeah.
I don't have a staff. I don't have people. I have to look for the information myself. Then I have to make the slides myself. And if I do all that, then I can't do anything else today.
Right.
And so just understand, if you insist on me having PowerPoint slides at every briefing, it means that that's what my job will be. I'll be the PowerPoint guy, because there is no one else. It's just me.
Yeah.
And, helping the military kind of understand that, and watching different senior leaders sort of, the ones who some of them had worked with the State Department before and understood. But watching the ones who were kind of like new to this whole thing react. What do you mean you don't have anyone? I mean, literally, there's no one. There's a bunch of alcoholic contractors who give away money at another location for us, but otherwise, I don't command or control anything, including someone just to help me with administrative stuff.
Yeah.
So
right. Yeah. Well, listen, I've had you for an hour, and that's exactly what I wanted, was to get that great insight, because it does illustrate that, okay, great, Orange Man bad and all that stuff, but understand that State Department stuff is really challenging, especially when there's just one of you. And you're right, like, you were in a room look, everybody, I have been in this room with Peter. He's by himself, and then there's the colonel sitting next to him because they're peers, and then there's sometimes 50 other people in that room, all working for the colonel.
Yep.
Or maybe it's just 20 people, but they're all in support of the colonel. And there's Peter like, here's my slide. It has a 7 on it because that's all I had time to do, Now, he had real slides, but the point is correct. Like, he's got so many things on his plate. And by the way, don't you dare call your hire. I've tried to call the State Department when I was in Iraq, like, hey, we have some important things here. Can we get some resources? Too busy. And I'm sure they were right. They were too busy. So just to illustrate that, man, I really appreciate it. It's an important lesson for all of us to see and learn. And calm down, get rid of the emotion, and go, really, what are we trying to do? Are we trying to keep Iran from becoming a nuclear power? Great. Are we trying to get them to come back to the world a little bit? Yes. Well, let's get to work on that and try to do that with as little death as possible, because sometimes airplanes full of people get killed because we can't get along across the table.
that's right. Thank you very much for having me.